Yeah, so like, what is a demon, right? Is a big question. One person's God is another person's demon. And in a pluralistic world in which gods are being traded back and forth and empires are invading other empires, and we know this was happening for hundreds of years, washing back of Persians and Greeks and, going back. So the origin of pantheons of demons, I sort of picture that coming from pantheons of gods that had conquered you. And if you didn't adopt this god as your god, you might have a few random gods that you could attribute evil to. Or maybe it was the mascot for some commander that had taken over your city. Well, that's a very natural demon. Maybe it's some people that they moved in to take all of the jobs and all of the housing, and they moved you out, and their god becomes your demon. So demons really it's a slippery concept to begin with. It could be culturally attuned, it could be that mysterious thing in the night. It's a deity or a divine spirit or an unknown that you just don't like. Now, the Greeks had this sort of desire to work with nature, right? And so the philosophies of a lot of the Greek, these philosophers that were working on everything as diverse as animal management and husbandry to land management and politics and everything that they could think of to make the world a more comfortable place. They were working on it and systematizing it and saying, well, we can do this. This is good. It's manageable. It's economically, we have an oikonomia now for the world, right? So they were working on a management system, and demons were no different. So I did say demon management. It's a phrase you could throw out there. It's a phrase I like to use for how the Greeks and many of the more ancient cultures, so the Babylonian, the Mesopotamian cultures, if you had any sort of a thinking person's culture in your civilization, then those people were probably working on some sort of a less hostile way to manage the unseen forces of the world. And the Greeks they came to see, or maybe originally saw, we're not really, tracing these things way back to prehistory is not necessarily fruitful. They saw the demons as something that was just very manageable, like pests and bugs and water, fish in the water. And so much like, if we think about how some of our Hindu friends and neighbors might conceptualize a pantheon of billions of spirits that are actuating all sorts of forces in this universe, in this world, and sort of just giving sort of a personal or a connected way of looking at things that we also ascribe scientific value to. Well, the Greeks did something very similar, and that might be sort of a default for a lot of the cultures of the world at that time, in the civilizations, to look at the world as a big pantheon of gradations of forces. Now, when does a god become a demon for a Greek philosopher? Probably when it's not being managed right and not being put to the right use. And so you have to learn how to work with the world you're in. And so theurgy, this science of working with gods and even demons, all spirits that might show up in a ritual, grew up around this idea of managing the unseen. And you can sort of trace it back to those days of Plato, and Socrates, and thinkers of that sort, who saw themselves as working very closely with various gradations of spirits. Socrates himself said, I have a daimon a demon essentially, a spirit that I didn't necessarily invite, but it gives me all this wisdom. And so he managed his life essentially through the revelation of a daimon. That is how Plato portrays him, and Plato sees this large scale pantheon of all kinds of spiritual entities and things like this. And this evolves over time in a million different ways, right? You have Gnostics, and several hundred years later you have all kinds of people doing all kinds of things with these thoughts. So it doesn't get less complicated ever, it always gets much more complicated. So we see prevailing trends, and that's what I tend to look for, is prevailing trends within all of that complication. Absolutely different. So if you were to ask a Nicene Christian in the 4th century, what do you think about demons? Oh, they would say, they're evil spirits. They're fallen angels. They're the gods of this world. They're put here to deceive us all. And our only recourse from this dystopian world that is actually run by demons is to come to Jesus, the victor over the demons and Satan. And he'll bring us to the kingdom of God out of this dismal kingdom. And that was their way of painting all of reality as dystopian. Quite a big brush, right? Now, they didn't come up with this on their own, and it wasn't so brand new that people scratched their heads and said, what are you talking about? I kind of think about every 100 years, if you start with the year 30 and then go to 130 and 230 and 330, and get to those Nicene Christians in the 300s, the 4th century, you can see a big change about every 100 years, marked in text. But the first Christian exorcist who shows up to put down a woman. Around the same time, up in Asia Minor, up in the hill country, there's a woman prophet whose name is lost to time. But the bishops down in Carthage and Rome were very afraid of her because she was amassing a movement, and they were trying to plant their own episcopal network up there, and she was her own network. She was a prophetess, she had deacons, she had presbyters, she had the whole thing. And she would do baptisms, and she would do it all, probably exorcisms. She did miracles, she could walk barefoot in the snow, she could predict earthquakes, which was very useful in Asia Minor at that time. So like she was just she was a powerhouse of a prophetess. And you might associate her with what later became known as the Montanist movement. Also, subsequently a huge target of this kind of exorcism. But she was really the first story that I come across, and the first Christian exorcist I find. So the bishops are writing to each other, and they say, she was doing all this awful things, feeding the poor, preaching, helping predict earthquakes, giving people community, terrible, terrible things. Because she was a woman. This is why it was terrible. And you see the emergence of sexism around this Episcopal bureaucratic movement as well. That's no accident that power and sexism go together. So this is where we see this phrase, a very fine man, one of the exorcists. And that's the first Christian exorcist you see. And what does he do? He just pops out of nowhere. He persecutes this woman. Gets her to confess that she's just full of the devil, just totally violent. I can only imagine what kind of aggressive process this was. Remember, we're hiring former actors and people who can scream and people who are accustomed to keeping a large audience entertained with whatever means you have to. And these are the kinds of people that gravitate into exorcism. It's a who can overpower whom. And he overpowers her, gets deacons and presbyters to confess to sleeping with her even. Whether they did or not, I don't know, but this was the pressure that he was laying on them. And this was the man that the bishops of Carthage and Rome said, finally, we have a man who we can call a Christian exorcist. So, in the ancient world, they did make a lot out of the genders and just the idea of giving and receiving. So the permeability of the body was already a problem that they worried about for men and women. But just due to the gendered nature of, for instance, sexual penetration, they thought a lot about these things, more than perhaps is made out of things today by most people. There are still those obsessed, sadly, and sexism is the result. But yes, so who gets exorcised? Women are a tremendously popular target amongst these, amongst particularly Christians, because it does evolve in these sorts of bureaucratic, power-hungry, money is involved, power is involved, and this is all before Constantine. This is all before Christianity is even legal. We're talking robes, and we're talking, who gets to the right spot in this nice building that we've built, and who gets to get buried with the Christians in a nice tomb and take care of your wife after you're dead, and those sorts of things, all before Constantine. So who's susceptible to possession? Women, children, and men who don't fit the bill, heretics, or effeminate, as they might have said back then. Just anything that wasn't quite what they were expecting out of a man that they would want to work with, or that would fall in line, if you will. So if you want to boil it down to three things: women, children, and heretics. Those are the people that get possessed, and those are then the targets for exorcism, or if you will, torment. Because exorcism actually did have a bit of a torment feel to it. Who are you tormenting? Well, you're tormenting the demon. Can you see a demon? No. So let's back up. Who are you tormenting? The person in front of you. And what does it look like? Well, it's not like, hot irons applied to the skin or anything like that, but it's certainly psychologically got to be a very rigorous and trying thing to go through, to be a woman or a child or a heretic or anyone under the face of this exorcist, screaming, shouting, blowing. They made a lot of the invisible air, right? So blowing and sucking and any kind of wheezing and all of these sorts of air noises, breathing, the pneuma, the air. So like gestures, screaming, you name it, imagery, hellfire, brimstone, your judgment is sure, you could be subjected to this for hours. Exorcism is firmly established by 330. You already have people who've worked their way up to bishop from exorcist. It's the lowest rank. You go exorcist to deacon to presbyter, and then you stay at all these offices for a long time, and you might eventually make it to bishop. It's based upon sort of the Roman bureaucratic rise, cursus honorum. And so if you see, there's a few exorcist tombstones that give the cursus honorum of a great man, if you will. But he started low as an exorcist. And this was sort of the ideal then. You would go, most people did not get promoted. Most exorcists did not get promoted. And I think I know why. They probably weren't as literate as most of the people coming in to be lectors, for instance, the readers. These were people who may have been accustomed to still improvising all of these things. And so as the liturgy evolved, it became part of the exorcisms and the baptisms, and it all sort of wove together into a big old liturgical universe that that the bishops wanted to sort of surround a person's approach to the church, your conversion, your baptism, your everything, all the way to the very end. Let's liturgize this person's life when you come to the church. And exorcism became liturgized. And the people they were hiring could not do liturgy. They could shout, they could stand in a little chapel that echoes like crazy. If you ever go to a site, an ancient site, and see these little baptistries, imagine somebody standing in there and screaming at you in the middle of the night with candlelight, wow. You would definitely want to get baptized to get that to stop. Whatever they said was wrong with you, it was quite a dramatic occurrence. They were great at that. They weren't great at opening up a text and saying, this is part of a larger drama, right? This drama unfolds as such in the flowery words of a Chrysostom. So under a Chrysostom, what happens, and this is in the 4th century, the 330s onward, you have bishops hiring exorcists, but they keep getting more and more menial and less likely to be promoted. Until Chrysostom has them coming into the church, bringing in the ones who can't be healed. You have all of a sudden this problem of demoniacs who are not getting healed. Something Jesus really never had to worry about. But when you're trying to do these things at scale, on a mass level, you're going to have all kinds of problems and loose ends and things that just don't work. Because you're trying to apply rules to things that there were no rules for. So Chrysostom's like, fine, I'll do the exorcism from the front, bring him in at a certain time. So the exorcists are almost like wardens or orderlies, and they're herding them in for this time when they get prayed for. And Chrysostom is like, Lord, have mercy upon these demoniacs and these people who are judging them. next to the rich man next to them, also help them because they're just as likely to be demon possessed as this crazy person next to them. It's like Chrysostom liked to do things like this all the time. That was sort of his rhetorical style, to let people know that they were all under his words. But that's what the exorcist becomes. So by the time you hit 430, you have to. What would an exorcist be? You see exorcists in the 400s and the 500s who are basically running insane asylums at this point. I see some sad terminology used in some of the early medieval, very late antiquity, texts that describe those who are in the lingering role of the exorcist as it sort of fades away in its entirety. It's brought back eventually, right? But it fades out in the 400s and 500s. No more epitaphs for exorcists after this. And partly because I think it's just like this really sad, like not very effective form of orderly whose specialization is being mean and rude and yelling and scaring people. Well, I mean, that's not what you need if you're evolving from the wild world of demoniacs out and about into a Christianized world where you're like, well, let's bring these people into an institutional, we got to do something, we can't have demoniacs roaming the streets anymore. I mean, that's not a good look for one thing when you Christianize. It kind of says, well, we haven't really solved all the problems we said we were solving, but it also, it's a humanitarian issue that they were interested in solving. And so this is where you have texts starting to come back. So Christians did suppress texts majorly, exorcism texts probably more than anything, I think. Because of all the areas where Christians were like, literacy is great, there was one place where they said books are wrong and literacy is wrong, and that is in the area of demons and exorcism. They were just very suspicious of all of that kind of a book, that genre. So you don't see Christian exorcism books until around 500, 600 somewhere in there. You start to see some Latin manuals of exorcism. They seem to have jammed maybe the first few of these in the hands of these exorcists who may or may not have been able to read. It wasn't a really popular kind of a manual. We don't see a lot of copies of those. What we do see happening is exorcisms just getting rolled into these larger codices of learned bishops' texts and monks' texts. And so anyone with a scholarly backing, and that would include pretty much all of your bishops, right? They had access to these exorcism texts, and they started to study them and collect them. And this is where we have the preservation of texts that they had previously suppressed, like the wisdom of Solomon's exorcisms, like Testament of Solomon type text. It has a long and complicated history of evolution from its days as a Jewish text through its medieval evolution in the hands of curious scholastics who thought, maybe they were onto something in all the schematization and ordering and systematizing and all the things that the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Jews even had done up until the fall of the temple. It had never been done in the Roman world. So I think what you see when you see the churchmen of the early medieval age starting to collect these exorcisms and these exorcistic books, you see not only the revival of something that had been suppressed, ancient wisdom, you also see perhaps the first time this has ever happened in a Roman context or a Greek or Roman context. First time you ever have anybody saying, let's collect specifically demon-related texts, right? Not just magic, not just spells, not just cures, but knowledge about demons and things like this. And then it's also some scholars, and I tend to take their word for this, but this is sometimes attributed as sort of the beginnings of our contemporary science of or psychological disciplines. Observations of human behavior became much more important and popular as some of these scholastic types tried to evaluate the efficacy of some of these exorcism texts through observation and some of these incipient scientific methods that were sort of clumsily coming along, throughout throughout different eras of intellectual evolution. And so it may have been, it may have contributed in a sort of back channel way to our interest in the human condition and the burgeoning science of psychology, had it not been suppressed and brought back.